Hello, this is Sebastian Barry at home, as you can see. And hello, this is Sebastian Barry at home, as you can see. And thank you all very much for coming, virtually anyway. Um, I had an extensive, for me, book tour of the independent bookshops set up um, at Faber for this very time, and I was immensely looking forward to it. I've never done it before, as I say, and but I might have been tipping in to places I have been singly before. So thank you so much to the four indies, the famous now four indies who've set this up. Lingham's, Bookish, Booker, and Forum Bookshops, and possibly a couple of others. It's a sort of privilege, and it's actually something of a joy to just be here with you. This is an old rectory where we live, and hello Amanda, hello Sue, hello Malcolm. And this room was probably where, not the old rector, because I think most of the rectors were young here because it was a very poor living, wrote their sermons. So I've been in here for the last 20 years as bravely as I can, writing my sermons, I suppose. It is quite curious that a lot of my plays and books are, in effect, more or less confessions of people, which ask you, if not to forgive them, at least to understand them. And that's what I've been doing. And of my 8 novels in this series, to which A Thousand Moons belongs, I think 6 of them have been written in this room where I'm sitting. Behind me, for instance, you can see over my right shoulder, I think, I'm pointing the wrong way, an interesting picture of the Americans in the First World War, when they came towards the end of the First World War, and more or less saved the day in some ways. But it's a very unrealistic picture because it suggests that men were able to go charging across open ground, which of course they weren't. So it probably was painted by somebody who was guessing what the war might be like, which I'm sure many of the soldiers were doing as they approached the battlefields. Then a mysterious picture of what's called, I think, the principal buildings of the world, which belonged to a lady called Miss Feary, who lived at the top of our house in Longford Terrace in the 60s. And she was very old, that's to say probably a bit older than me, and bent over by brittle spine or whatever. But in her house, she had a number of these prints. One of them was also a picture of herself as a beautiful young woman being presented at Dublin Castle, which was their form of coming out, or a debutante's ball, or whatever it was, which gave me sort of insight into the span of a life, which I've also been trying to pursue ever since. And then there's a picture of 2 bears wrestling that my son Merlin gave me. I'm still trying to work out the symbolism of it. I'm going to, as I would if I were with you in proper buildings, in one of the churches or temples of literature, which I think is what bookshops are in effect, which is why, for my part, I want to passionately support them by this tiny gesture of doing this, for instance. But that's part of my purpose tonight. We mustn't have gaps like fallen, teeth that have fallen out in the high street. Any of them representing a bookshop, which is a sacred place, obviously. And even when we've been put under this incredible strain as human beings, I think we do realize that we rest our faith in certain permanent things, one of which might be stories. This book is called A Thousand Moons. This is the beautiful book that Faber made for it, with its lovely gold and silver. And it's told to us by Winona, who in the previous book, Days Without End, was the young Lakota woman who is adopted by Thomas and John. And now she's telling her story. This is a few years after the American Civil War. And she begins in chapter 1, so that's where I'll start. And it was again in this room where I had to wait for her for about 9 months before she wanted to say anything to me. So I'm very happy that finally she spoke in her quiet voice. I am Winona. In early times, I was Odejinka, which means rose. Thomas McNulty tried very hard to say this name, but he failed, and so he gave me my dead cousin's name because it was easier in his mouth. Winona means firstborn. I was not firstborn. My mother, my elder sister, my cousins, my aunts, all were killed. They were souls of the Lakota that used to live on those old plains. I wasn't too young to remember, maybe I was 6 or 7, but all the same I didn't remember. I knew it happened because afterwards the soldiers brought me into the fort and I was an orphan. A little girl can suffer many a sea change. By the time I got back to my people, I couldn't converse with them. I remember sitting in the teepee with the other women and not being able to answer them. By that time, I was all of 13 or so. After a few days, I found the words again. The women rushed forward and embraced me as though I had only just arrived to them that very moment. Only when I spoke our language could they really see me. Then Thomas McNulty came to get me again and took me back to Tennessee. Even when you come out of bloodshed and disaster, in the end you have got to learn to live. You have to look about you, see how things are, grow things or buy things as the case may be. The little town nearby us in Tennessee was called Paris. Lige Megan's farm was about 7 miles out. It was quite a few years after the war, but the town was still full of rough Union soldiers kicking their heels, and the defeated butternut boys were a sort of secret presence, though they were not in their uniforms. Vagabonds on every little byway, and state militia watchful for those vagabonds. It was a town of many eyes watching you anyhow, an uneasy place. To present yourself in a dry goods store to buy items, you have got to have best English or something else happens. At the fort, Mrs. Neal had given me my first English words. In later times, John Cole got me 2 books of grammar. I looked at them long and good. It is bad enough being an Indian without talking like a raven. The white folks in Paris were not all good speakers themselves. Some were from other places, Germans, Swedes. Some were Irish like Thomas McNulty and only got to English when they got to America. But myself, being a young Indian woman, I guess I had to talk like an empress. Of course, I could have offered my list of items that Rosalie Bougereau, who worked on Lige's farm, had written out, but it was better to speak. Else what was happening was I was going to be beaten up every time I was in town. It was English kept me from that. Some straggly farmhand might look at you and see the dark skin and the black hair and think that gave him a right to knock you down and kick you. No one saying boo to him for that. No sheriff or deputy neither. It wasn't a crime to beat an Indian. Not at all. And that's the first couple of pages of that book. And as I was reading it, I remembered being in California, in Marin County, in a little museum there. It was a coastal Miwok museum, and there was a lady there, and when I said I was Irish, I think she thought I was Irish American or something. But I said, no, I'm actually Irish from Ireland. And I don't know if that made a difference to her, but she said, you're asking about, what it is to be native now. And she said, I grew up on a reservation, and every time my father went into town to buy stuff, to buy goods, whatever, he was beaten up. And she told me that. She didn't smile, she didn't frown or anything. She just told me that straight. And for better or for worse, a couple of years later, I took that as my signal. But a book obviously has a long journey, like comets do as they come near the Earth. Apparently, there's one just approaching us. They have a long journey to come from wherever they come from. And this book maybe started for me 50 more years ago when I shared a bed with my grandfather in the cold of an Irish winter. And he told me that his great uncle had been at the Indian Wars. And I suppose I thought I knew what that meant because I used to go and see the cowboy films up in the Adelphi Cinema in Dunleary in Ireland. But in another way, of course, I knew nothing about what he was saying. And it took 50 years to think about it, and also to finally have a conversation with a wonderful, magical person called Peter Matheson, who really laid himself on the line in support of modern Native America with his book In the Spirit of Crazy Horse, which was sued for a libel action by the CIA or the FBI, or because it dealt with the troubles in Dakota in the 70s. And his passion, what could you call that? Kind of loving, straight-talking, even-keeled passion for the central injustice of the Genesis story of modern America, which is that it's predicated on an erasure. That really burned in him, and it was very extraordinary to be with him. He himself looked like an extraordinary graven image. He gave me his book. He sent it to me in the Spirit of Crazy Horse, and it's a battered old hardback, and he wrote in it there, if you can see it. And the magical part of it is, he said at the end of it, let's meet again when the smoke clears. And I fully wanted to go and talk to him about Days Without End and this book, A Thousand Moons. But unfortunately, he died. But actually, for a man like that, I'm not sure death was fully relevant to his ending, because I feel he's been assisting me ever since, really. So they're the 2 points for the book. And Days Without End was written very much in response to Peter, but I had a feeling that when I finished it that, well, even something somebody pointed out to me, or a reader told me at an event, actually, we only have Winona through his eyes. And his eyes are incredibly loving eyes, but at the same time, it's not her telling you. And that seemed to me the most crucial absence in Days Without End. And I was concerned about it, but both by the absence and by the possibility, could you actually fill that absence? And I kept an ear out for what my editor, Angus Cargill at Faber, was thinking about it, because he's a wise person. And eventually he kind of gave me the signal for it, as he does in his mysterious way. So it's because of that, you see, it's not really a sequel. It's been called a sequel, but it's not really a sequel, because you don't get Thomas's vivacious, not ironic, actually, he's not in any way ironic, but you don't get Thomas's voice, whatever that voice is, whoever that was in my workroom. You get this much quieter person who is his adopted daughter. And I accidentally, I think, I've only recently realized that because we have an adopted daughter, that we sort of knew something about that relationship, because the daughter chooses you and you choose her. And actually, that's a profoundly mysterious but hugely loving undertaking. And I don't think Thomas and John, for instance, love Winona the less because she's not supposedly theirs, because she's in some senses more theirs, because they found each other out there on the high plains. If indeed, however, I should say for my film contract, which I'm happy to say I have, it is called a sequel, and the most amazing, one of the most amazing people in film today, Tessa Ross, is hoping to make a film of Days Without End, and then make a film quite shortly afterwards of A Thousand Moons, recognizing that they are, well, I suppose parent and daughter books. I don't know. I'm going to come on to your brilliant questions that you've been sending me. I'm trying to see. Oh, yes. I'm scrolling up through the messages. Emma, Linda, Nick. Oh, Mr. Biesenbach, yes. Carl, that's my daughter. What's she doing on? Susan Barry. Rosamond Delahaye from Main Street now, Main Street Trading Company in St. Boswell's. Have you ever, I don't know if you've ever been, but I was very looking forward to getting there again on this now mythical book tour. Really an extraordinary place. Apart from the brilliant bookshop, it's where Duke of Buccleuch, who gives the money, as it were, for the Walter Scott Prize, used to keep his hounds before hunting was banned in England. That's why everyone comes to Ireland to hunt now. Hannah Dwan. There's Hannah now. Wonder who that is. Jane Chance, Heather Roddenhurst, Daniel Frid. Oh, BookBugs. So if you have any questions, and I accept my daughter from this, she's not allowed to ask any questions, or either daughter. Do it. You can ask me in the side, but I have been sent other questions, so I will answer them. I think I will. I was going to read a little bit more, but I think I'll just answer your questions first. Gil, or Jill, says, Gil, I think, what are you most looking forward to personal or career-wise after lockdown? Well, that could be a lot of things. Are we allowed to call it our 90% of our lives? I don't know. I mean, another way, I do love living here. We're in this old house in the Wicklow Mountains on the Wicklow Way. Very, very, very beautiful. I'm 64, but as long as I can still run that mountain every second day, I consider myself to be mostly alive. But there are things that keep. Now we know that there are things that we value that maybe we didn't even notice properly or see with the proper eyes. But I know there's a little tiny beach on the island of Paros called Drios, where I used to bring the kids. We used to go en famille every few years as they grew bigger and bigger, and eat in the little taverna, the top of the steps, and go down to the sea, which was so clear and clean and simple. Poliore, Dina Kanema. Well, we'll get back to that. I would also, just a month ago, I had this strange experience of doing something which I had never done in my so-called career as a playwright, which is have a play on the West End. And we were in Trafalgar Studios, the most amazing theatre, with a play called On Blueberry Hill, with Niall Buggy and David Ganley being gods in this little play. And for some reason, the town seemed to like it, and we were very, very happy that night. I have to be clear about that. And 4 days later, it closed because of the coronavirus. So I would like maybe to, if the gods conspired, to put that moment back again together. But we did have it once, so perhaps that's greedy. Kerry asks me, Kerry, do you have an author that, not the county, I presume, this person, do you have an author that has inspired you to go on a literary pilgrimage? Yes, I like to see where writers were lurking for all the decades, whatever, that they were writing their books. I've been to, just a couple of years ago, my wife and I, Ali and I, snuck away to see where Thomas Hardy was a boy. Very beautiful little house. Conrad, I went to Canterbury. We were putting a play into the cathedral for the festival, actually. And while I was there, I looked for Joseph Conrad because he lived near Canterbury. And of course, it took me a while to figure it out, but obviously he was Polish and therefore Catholic. So he didn't belong to the big cathedral. There was a tiny little, I think they called it a cathedral, a Catholic cathedral in the town, amazingly. And he had been married there, I think, to Jessie, unless I'm mistaken in that. And then there's a little graveyard, a little Catholic graveyard tucked away, quite very much in the town. And there he is, there's his grave. And there's an account of his funeral. And at that very day, the town was absolutely full of people. But it wasn't for Conrad, it was because it was the great cricket festival of that time. There's sort of irony there. But I think Conrad also, I think his death was just a technicality. I think he has gone on living. Lisa, but then there's another person. Now, this would be an extravagant pilgrimage, but just recently I thought, could I go to the South Seas to look for Robert Louis Stevenson? And by chance, I have this book, which I'm reading, which is called In the South Seas by somebody called R. Louis Stevenson, so I guess it's him. And also by chance, very, very magically, if you can see whose book this was, when they lived in Pent Farm, and it's signed Jessie Korzeniowska, which is the feminine of Korzeniowski, which was Conrad's full Polish name. So that's a book owned by Conrad's wife, Jessie, whom I'm also very interested in. I think was obviously an incredible individual. And he writes about the Marquesas Islands, is that how you pronounce it in this book? Which is the first islands he got to, which he said was a particularly magical thing in Journey. But he describes the inhabitants, the original inhabitants, the native peoples, as having been reduced from 10,000 to 40, or by the smallpox, which would have been brought by the Europeans. So this virus that they had no immunity against was killing them. And there's an extraordinary chapter in this book, literally about death and the attitude of the native peoples to death. Their attitude, they had adapted a kind of philosophical sang-froid about the whole business, which possibly could be universally learned just at the moment. Sue, why did you decide to write 1,000 Moons? Well, I think I explained that to sort of give, not to give her a voice, but to find her voice, because I thought it was a missing piece of music. What was it like being inside Winona's head? Well, this is actually where I sit working. So it's not so much being in her head as feeling that her head is quite close to mine. And although she's writing the book probably when she's about my age, maybe she's in her 60s writing the book, nevertheless, it felt like the way a child puts his or her head in close to you, you know, when they're small or up to the age of 11 or so, when they're not self-conscious in any way. So you get that priceless closeness, and that's what it felt like to be near Winona. I had a photograph taken by Edward Curtis, one of the huge series of photographs that he made for one of the American presidents. I think there's 19 volumes. And although they're a little bit suspect in that many times when he was photographing native sorts of native people, they no longer were wearing their traditional costumes or whatever you'd call it, but he would put them back in. So, okay, it's a little bit of fictionalizing going on there. But anyway, I had this particular photograph on my screensaver, as it were, for a good number of years. And so just a very honest person of the Quahatica, a young woman just looking out at me, very silent until, I hope, this book. I actually passed by Lisa. I'll go back to Sue. Lisa said, what has been the most happy situation you have experienced and why? And I think it was living in Greece near that place I described when I was 25 in 1980. Not that I haven't been happy since, but just that it was my first experience after childhood, in a way, of a pure happiness, of being in a beautiful place that was beneficent and kind, and being with a group of friends, which was what they call the Perea in the summer, which was unusual for me. And my beautiful friend Gregorio Altamirano was there, who died recently. One of the most beautiful men I have ever seen on God's earth, I'm telling you. He was probably about 29 at that time. And that whole experience, and being so, swimming across the bays and coming into town, into the village in the evening, as strong as one will ever be again, and 25 and just, I don't know, bursting with health and joy. Too much so, in a way, because I had to go back to the bleakness of Northern Europe to be able to write. Anything I wrote in Greece, unfortunately, was like the first volume of poetry of a lotus eater. It just didn't have I don't know what is wrong with us that we can't write well in Greece. A terrible failing. So back to Sue. Was it difficult writing from a woman's point of view? Well, everything is difficult. But, I mean, writing from a man's point of view can be depressing. But anyway, leaving that aside, not in Thomas's case, though, I have to say. In the mountains behind me here, in front of me, Cadine Mountains is where my great aunt lived towards the end of her life. And we were left with her in 1959. It's the subject of a little book called Annie Dunn, actually. And she said she was 59, but I found out later that she'd taken 13 years off her age. Very film starry thing to do. She was an incredible woman. She had a hunchback, so she had been considered unmarriageable. And yet when we were left with her, she was, my sister and myself, my sister Siobhan, she was our experience of mothering, ironically. She was amazing with her her cousin, Sarah Cullen. And they shared a bed, Sarah and Annie. They shared a bed together in the house. So even now I'm wondering, is that a wonderful relationship that I just didn't have words for when I was small, or even later? I hope so. That they were in effect in love with each other. But anyway, she was such an amazing woman and spoke so beautifully in her Wicklow accent, which of course I couldn't understand when I would arrive first from Dublin. It would take me a few days to get used to the unsalted butter and her unsalted accent. I was only 4. I was so in love with that woman that my ambition in life was not to be a train driver or space traveler or whatever little boys want to be. But I just wanted to be, as it turned out, a 72-year-old woman. So is it difficult to write in that voice? I don't know. Have I ever properly made the distinction? I probably have, mostly, but sometimes you hope you live with all genders or something. That's a difficult thought. It would take us another few hours to work that one out. Well, who is your favorite author? These are great questions, Sue, but it's Conrad, I have to admit. Conrad, and his wife Jessie actually wrote this couple of amazing books about being with him, which is one of the few times in literary history where you can get a sense of what it's like to live with a slightly driven, I was going to say demonic, but incredibly obsessive person like Conrad. I mean, they are brilliant books. So Jessie is also my favorite author in a funny sort of way. Rory, I'd like to know how you settled on a voice for Winona. Well, I read as many books as I could, linguistic books and all this. It does help a little bit, but not ultimately completely. You have to make it up. There's a wonderful book by a man called Charles Eastman, who was a native person himself. I think his mother or his grandmother was white, as one would say. Anyway, he had an Indian boyhood. He was. They fled up to Canada at some point, and it was only when he was around 16, I think, that his father, whom he thought was dead, came to collect him and brought him back down to America to introduce him to American life. He wanted him to enter that, and he did, and he became a doctor, and he became a great man on the reservation, and married a lady. I don't know quite what to say about white people, but anyway, a European person. And he wrote these amazing books. And this book, Native Boyhood, which I have here, actually, gave me the other pin or the starting point, because he's talking about his grandmother, very much like Winona now talks about her mother in A Thousand Moons. And he says, in bravery, his grandmother equaled any of the men. This trait, together with her ingenuity and alertness of mind, more than once saved her and her people from destruction. And that's a note I wanted to borrow or beg or steal into A Thousand Moons, because it seemed to me so important, because it's the idea of the courage of women. And if I know anything about the courage of women, I've learned it from my two incredible daughters. And it is, I mean, it's been it's been a privilege and an unexpected one to have daughters, and even to be married was unexpected, and to have sons, obviously. But it's really opened my eyes when they're growing up, how what you have to go through as a young person, as a young female person in this world that we have constructed. And at some points it shocked me, and at some points it made my eyes wide open to certain forms of danger, just as my amazing son Toby being gay sort of opened another form of blindness in the eye. But Rory says about the voice, it's very odd pigeon crossed with old-fashioned US, and I guess it is. And when she's in her narrative, her English is, as she says, like an empress's, because she has learned the language so well. Indeed, like Conrad did. Conrad was 30 before he actually spoke or wrote English properly, and he never actually spoke English except with a very, very impenetrable Polish accent, apparently. But his writing, obviously, is supremely opaque. Is that the right word? I mean, clear. Perhaps it means the opposite of that. I don't know. I'm never sure about that word. He says, my friend Rory, I guess I wondered how he settled on something authentic to him, and how prepared he was in these times of sensitivity about cultural appropriation to face First Nation readers with his interpretation of one of their possible ancestors. Well, I suppose the weird gift of Days Without End to me was, because Thomas is a fictional version of my ancestor, this O'Hara or McNulty who went to the Indian Wars, according to my grandfather. The fact that in the course of writing that book, or in the course of listening for that book, Winona appeared, gave me the audacity, the unearned audacity, you might say, to say, well, this is, if Thomas and John regard her as a daughter and she regards them as her parents, then who am I as her descendant, as it were? Not to deny her position in my mythical family, but to honor it. So that would be my feeling about it. There were many, many, many displaced people in all of human history, of all sorts and all kinds. And indeed, it was something Peter Matheson said to me that I also used, as it were, on Canaan's side, another of the novels. Mr. Dillinger says that he says the most important thing we've been told in our lifetimes is about DNA, and that we're all descended from this 3 to 5 women in Africa, and that the good news, says Mr. Dillinger, is we're all the same family, and the bad news is we're all the same family, because we know the trouble that causes. And therefore, I'm not making a distinction somehow. I think we also need to be able to imagine our way into other conditions of being in order both to honor them and also include them and also include ourselves. When I brought that photograph to the Zuni Pueblo in Mexico last year, I don't even know why I brought it, but anyway, I showed it to this amazing man who was the guide bringing me to see the paintings. And he said, "Oh, I know that woman. She was a woman of this Pueblo." And now he's talking about things, 1,000 years doesn't seem to be a great deal of time to this man. He was called Sean, as it happened, which is, I suppose, an Irish name. But and although I knew from Kurtz's book that she wasn't actually from there, the book tells me that she was from further west in Arizona, that she's Oaxaca, which was a subgroup, as they say, of the Pima. And he even goes as far as to say that the Pima didn't respect these people, Oaxaca, because they were so poor. And yet you should see this face looking out from the photograph. And the other thing that moved me greatly was they no longer exist. There's no trace of those people anywhere now. There's a kind of a town named something like Oaxaca there. And that meant that when Sean said she was a woman of that Pueblo, he was kind of positioning her there, and also closing for me a kind of sense of pilgrimage with the whole question of the book. I mean, this is how writers operate, and as you can see, it's not entirely, we're not talking entirely about mental stability here, are we? Or sense or practicalities. But this is what I've been doing for 44 years. This sort of curious, I don't know, looking into things with blind eyes and trying to unblind myself, as it were. Jake Tinsley, there's a name. I hope he's a writer. I hope you're a writer, Jake, because that's his writer's name. When it comes to your novels, are you inspired by the moment in history and then create the character story, or do the character story come first and decide which period of history they are placed in? Well, most of my books are hunting for people. My eye is caught by a very good question by Richard Newton there. So I'm always looking for these lost members of my family. And for the first number of books, somebody about two tiny little stray facts survive of them, and I have to rub them together to make a little fire, and that's the book. So even though no one said to me, "Oh, and by the way, one of your ancestors was a native Lakota person," by the way, because I found her there in that book, I sort of including her in that sense of erasure. I mean, you're talking about a family where my great uncle, another great uncle, went to America during the Civil War, at the end of the Civil War, because he'd been told there was a death threat against him. And then his family were told subsequently that he had died in an accident at a reservoir because he was an engineer. But in fact, he'd been murdered for being on the wrong side of Irish history, and then he's not spoken about. And my great-grandfather, who was the chief superintendent of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, he didn't even have a grave in Glasnevin Cemetery. I mean, he didn't have a stone, is what I mean. His family wanted to forget him. And it was my friend Dermot Bulger, the writer, who found a way for me to find him. We're talking about erasure here on every side. So I don't choose. What I'm saying is I don't choose the period of history. I try to choose the person, or I'm trying to get the person to choose me and bring me back to that place. Always thinking of Einstein's theory of time, which tells us that although we move through time, all time events are still there behind us. So a novelist is actually trying to prove that, in a sense, by going back so authentically, as it were, hopefully, that you're actually accessing something that is quite real, or as real as we are. And are we particularly real? Sometimes we must question that. Another question to the playwright: which plays and playwrights would you recommend reading and seeing if you wanted to learn more about the form? Well, in my view, I'm not sure you have to go much further than Shakespeare. We read King Lear for the Leaving Cert here, which is the final exams at school, at secondary school or high school, and I think I learned everything in that play. There's those big gobs of speeches, and you think, oh my God, as a child, they look at these inert, huge stones of speeches, and then when they're read, they become these radiant, pulsing flows of lava, sort of liquid stone. And then there are scenes in Lear, say at the end, between himself and Cordelia as she dies, that would be effective in any language, in any age, in any moment. So that would be my instinct about it. We don't need to. You could spend, most of your life learning from just that one play, I would have thought. Anon says, oh, I can't answer this question. Oh dear. I love the secret scripture and would love to know what Sebastian thought about Theo Jane's portrayal of Father Gaunt. I would have awarded him a BAFTA. Well, I think all actors, I would give all actors, great actors, BAFTAs every Monday. But I was a little out of sorts with the film version. I'm sorry. It was a terrific job that Jim Sheridan did, but see, part of my instinct for Father Gaunt, for instance, now that you say it, Anon, it's not Jim, is that he doesn't desire Roseanne in the secret scripture. That seemed really important to me, that he was sort of frighteningly noble and good in his own way. And actually, Roseanne says that in the novel. She doesn't blame him. He had a set of thoughts that were deeply oppressive, and destructive to her, but they came from sort of genuine principles. So I actually didn't like it, that suggestion of sexual desire of the priest for Roseanne in the film. But let's leave it there. I think I've said enough about that. Anon wants to know, what is the best thing and worst thing about being an author? The best thing about being an author, I have found, is that you can effect the miracle of bringing up your children from books, of making a house for them, of feeding them, of clothing them, with the huge concomitant parallel activities of my wife, Ali, the screenwriter, out of books that you can do that, and that send them to university. I mean, for instance, The Secret Scripture, which was about a woman who never had anything really and was incarcerated in an asylum for 40, 50, 60 years and was therefore childless, although we find out that's not quite true at the end, familyless. That book gave the money, as it were, the little pot of money to send them the children to university. So that's the best thing about being a writer, just to report those things. There's sort of a reportage. This is possible. The worst thing about being a writer is that your income is entirely endangered the whole time, in the sense that in a recent survey in the UK, and I'm speaking here as a laureate for Irish fiction as well, the median earnings was 5,000 a year. Some writers don't even get that. So, and obviously we've no pensions, and at 64 you begin to wonder, how is your, how are you looking forward to the slices of stale bread? But we'll see. So that's the worst part of it. But actually, it's a wild privilege being a writer. That's it. It's like, I don't know, having something conferred on you that is sort of huge medicine. Like a native person would have an elephant's, or not an elephant's, but a buffalo scrotum full of precious objects, which would give him medicine for battle. And being a writer sort of puts stuff in there for the fight of life. Fight isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it's a sort of noble enough endeavor. Anon asked me, do you prefer to write novels or plays? I actually find them both bizarrely, impossibly difficult. And is one more difficult than the other? Not really. I mean, the difference for me between a novel and a play is that a novel takes 3 years, whereas a play, you might spend 10 years waiting for a play, as I did for On Blueberry Hill. But as Lorca said, if it takes any play that takes more than 10 days to write probably has something wrong with it. Isn't that a terrifying statement? But that's the difference, I think. What is next for me? I think what's next for me is, I'm going to sort of look through slitted eyes and half cocked to what Angus Cargill, my editor, intends for me. We always have a few books vaguely mentioned when we meet in the park in London and drink our coffee, and we talk about a few things, and then he sort of intimates, and I sort of half hear him, and then we nod a bit. So that's probably what's going to happen next, although maybe not in a park in London just yet. I'm saying hello to Jenny Keating, to Jackie Dean, to Moira Tulloch Penman. Is that not one of the best names you've ever heard of? And there's my friend Jake. Rory Fields. I was trying to get back to Tracy Edwards, Alma Smith. I'll read these after. Richard Newton. He says, have you read the science fiction novel The Inheritors Conrad wrote with Ford Madox Ford? I mean, what a story that is in itself. And Jessie Conrad's very interesting about Ford in her account of her life with Joseph Conrad. Would you ever collaborate on a novel with one of your contemporaries? I'm not clever enough to do that. I have some horribly good contemporaries. Have you noticed? Like Colin Tabine and Joseph O'Connor and Dermot Bulger and Emma Donoghue. And, well, no, she's much younger than me, but frighteningly good. I'd be scared that they would find out that I was, just a chancer, really. I do feel I've been collaborating a little bit with the natural writer in all my characters. And most of my books now are written down by the person themselves. So I feel there is a collaboration there. You know the way they say everyone has a novel in them? I don't think that's necessarily true, but I do think it's possible that everyone has a story in them. Well, of course they do. It's their life story. So I try to collaborate with these, I won't call them ghosts or vanished people, because Einstein says that's total illusion. We just don't have the sufficient number of senses to understand time properly. So actually, I'm collaborating with Odejinka, which is known as proper name, and with Thomas, and with Roseanne, and with Lily, and with Willie Dunn, and Ennius McNulty. I'm looking for I have their kinship, I believe, but I'm also looking for their friendship, which, as you may have noticed, is a slightly different thing in families. We're related to numbers of people. We're not friends with them all. We would probably either put our cloak in the mud for all of them, if it was a question of them stepping out of the carriage into the mud. And for numbers of them, we would throw ourselves in front of bullets and speeding trains, wouldn't we? But friendship is a different matter. I have been blessed with unexpected friends, some of them writers too. Roy Foster, I have sort of collaborated with, the historian, but without writing anything down. Do you know? He has whispered in my ear certain important things that gave me food for the journey, you know. Okay. I think we're coming up to, I was just looking now, I'm going to have to, some of you are being so loving. And have I read that book, The Inheritors? I've actually looked at that book. I've read all of Conrad's books, even The Rescue, is that what it's called? Or The Rover, which is quite hard to read. But I haven't read the ones they did together. Didn't they do, the only novel that was a bestseller for Conrad in his time? There's another issue. We were talking about writers' incomes. He had no income, not one that would sustain him. He was obviously, you know, he was a nobleman, really, a Polish nobleman, but he lived very poorly. And I think it was Pinker, his agent, who jimmied together the money. And he was always writing, you know, passionate, screaming letters to get more money. But I think one of the books they wrote together, now you'll have to correct me, I think it's called Chance, but I have a feeling it mightn't be. But it was a bestseller for Conrad, but the only one in his entire lifetime. Now you can look at all his other books. I mean, take heart, my beautiful fellow writers, from that, because none of Conrad's books, even the one or two Impossible to Read, has been out of print since he died. And that's quite something. That's what I mean. He lives on. He did write, now, to be honest, 6, 7, 8 masterpieces in a row, which is quite unusual. The only person I said recently who reminded me of that was Anne Enright, who just keeps writing masterpieces. I don't know how that's happening. I'd like to know how. Wouldn't you? I'd like to find out. It might be something she does that we could learn from. Maybe she's keeping it quiet. Alma Smith, hello. Tracy Edwards. Oh, she's dropped off. Ah, okay. I'm just going down. I'm sorry for this, kind of weird, isn't it? Rory Fields. Oh, they're talking to each other. You're talking to each other. Very good. Jackie Dean. Jenny Keating, an old friend of your daughter's here. Hello. If you're a friend of my daughter's, you're a friend of mine. Two finer people never existed. Is it chance? It is chance, and I should know, says Jane. Chance. Well, that's kind of glorious. I was going to read you a tiny little bit at the end, and here's the end coming up. And I just wanted to read you the bit in the book where Rosalie and Tennyson Bougereau and Winona or Odinjinka and Thomas and John get to Whit Monday and have a sort of a party. And it's only a page and a half. Or two, a little bit more. And then we're finished, I think, because unless I'm insane, we have 6.5 minutes left. Before I read this and give you a fond farewell, I just want to say that just before I started the podcast, and I didn't want to say it at the beginning because it would make me too sad, I heard that Ivan Boland had died, who is one of our very great poets, and not only a very great poet, but a great helper. And she changed poetry, certainly for women, but she also changed poetry, writing for some of us stray men as well. Certain things she said. And she's one of the first people to notice that modern American poetry could be an influence. Because when I was writing, it was all Eastern Europe and all the rest of it. And she noted something there. She'd been a lot in America. And she wrote permanent poems herself. She also said something very interesting, which I've been thinking about ever since, and it's probably 30 years ago. She said it. She said it would be surprising if a person of John Keats's education, couldn't write The Eve of St. Agnes. That was like the first shot fired across the bow of this male hierarchical poetry. Thank God. Hallelujah. So I'll finish just reading. I'll just finish with something else I hope Winona told me in my workroom. Now we had come up to Whit Monday, and that was a day that Lige Megan gave as a holiday. No soul was to stoop to work that day. Lige set his rotary firewater on the table for any to drink that wished. Thomas McNulty was accustomed on Pentecost Eve to kill a suckling pig and hang it, and allow it slowly to bleed its blood into a bucket. Then on the Holy Monday up stepped the wizard Rosalie, and made her blood pudding, and Lige lit the wood fire in the yard and ran a long iron spike through the pig, and then he stood there like a sentry turning the spit, like a picket against the burning of the meat. This was a joyous day, even for those that didn't have joy inside them, a mortgaged joy that even mournful folk could borrow. Then you saw Lige Megan risen with his fiddle and the lovely calm close of that summer day, and the wood saved from the woods all round burning brightly, and its first shadows like children leaping in the yard. It was the day for beginning all again, and though it was in the aftertime of Leavenworth, when he was seldom in his dress, Thomas McNulty on Whit Monday donned his dress, because the thing that Rosalie most craved to see was the old dance he used to dance in Grand Rapids when he was so handsome and beautiful that hard miners asked for his hand, which was a thing I saw for myself. They would come like a gaggle to the stage door, looking for the beautiful woman that had beguiled them so, and Thomas going out past them, not even glanced at, in the man's attire he put on to walk home in, a smile on his lips. Now in his age he could never be so fancied, but there with his friends and the man who so loved him, we revered him. We watched his lonesome dance. His feet were still small in his patent shoes, and the metal beads on the dress still threw light onto his painted face. John Cole was stood at the window while the night fell all around him. Years fell away, and maybe to himself he was young again, and Thomas was young, and they were in their heyday of hope and enterprise. And let us all be in our heyday of hope and enterprise. And I note, reading that my hours and hours with my son watching RuPaul's Drag Race were not entirely in vain. Thank you so much for being here with me. You have made me feel 110% less lonesome. Thank you, thank you, thank you to all the wonderful independent bookshops for putting it together. Good night to you.